Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Eric. Today I've got a book I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon. This is not really a review. I'll just kind of call it just some thoughts and observations on a really big, complex novel. Now I believe this is the sixth Pynchon I've read, probably in the past 15, 20 years or so. So I still have a few more I need to get to. But yeah, it took me a few months to get through Against the Day. So just to talk a little bit about the novel. So it's a historical novel. The time frame begins in the 1890s, Chicago's World Fair, 1893, and we go up until the end of the First World War. So the book ends around 1918, 1920. Somewhere around that time. And what's nice is that we don't get specific dates. Pynchon rarely gives us. He'll give us events sometimes, but he'll rarely give us specific dates of when what is taking place. So that's the scope. A big scope, covers a wide swath of time. The First World War, of course, 1914, 1918, is the sense. There's a sense throughout this book that the world is heading to a catastrophe, and yet we don't really spend really much time at all with World War One. There's really just a few pages where that actually deal directly with the war, but one gets a sense of all the possibilities of the world before the war. So Pynchon's doing a lot with genre in this book. He's taking genres that were popular during this time period and trying to revise them, reinvent them, update them. So there's a lot of elements of the Western inside this book. There's a lot of elements of science fiction, early science fiction. Earlier, there's like the more Jules Verne variety of very sci-fi that's full of wonder and adventure. And then we get into more H.G. Wells type science fiction, where it becomes more about dread and warnings about the future. The Time Machine being one example. So there's a strong influence there. And the Western side of it, to go back to that, is about there's a big part of the book is set in Colorado and Mexico as well, in the West, and a lot of the themes there get into capitalism and how American capitalism was gradually taking over the West, and the mentality was taking over that part of the country. So that's one big part of it. We also get a lot of travelogue. This is a global book. There are sections all over the world, really. We spend time in America. We spend a lot of time in Europe. We also spend some time in Asia as well. So it is global in its scope. Yeah, so there's also this, like the old Boys' Adventures. There's a section of the novel that follows characters who go by the Chums of Chance, who are these group of boys who fly an airship, loosely modeled on like adventures written for kids. So there is that. So Pynchon's taking all these genres and starts to mash them up together. And as the book unfolds, as it gets more and more complex and deeper, the experimentation continues with all of these genres. Really, my reading of the book, it kind of goes in almost like three different movements at least. You might compare it to like a symphony, where the first third of the book, a lot of it is sets in the West, and we have a lot of sections on science and scientific theory. This is before the theory of relativity was discovered and theorized by Albert Einstein. So there was a lot of scientific speculation in the air at the turn of the century, and also the idea of there being a fine line between mysticism and science, that the idea of invisible worlds, how X-rays and other technology could, sound waves, like they could all show us some other form of reality that we're not sure of. So there's just a lot of speculation about science in here as well. So the first third of the book is a lot of abstractions, a lot of emphasis on conflict in the West. And I should mention there's hundreds of characters in this book, but the main through line is through the Travers family. The father of this family was an anarchist who battled the mining companies in the West, and this character is killed off by one of the corporations, and it's really what happens to the family, the Travers family, after this as they kind of scatter around. So that's really the main narrative threads going through the book. So there's a lot happening in the West in the first third of it. There's a lot the scientific stuff and the scenes on the airship, where we're following the Chums of Chance, who are off on these adventures, and we're not sure like if this is real or fantasy, because there is a sense like these characters exist in some kind of different alternate reality, and that's another big theme of the book too, is reality versus alternate reality, and you know how to tell the difference between the two. A lot of the middle part of the book takes place in Europe, and I should have mentioned too, there's a heavy like spy novel influence on this, espionage novel. So we're in Europe in the 1900s, in the lead up to the First World War. There's a lot of it takes place in Venice, but there's other parts of Europe as well. There's a big part that's in Belgium. And we get the sense there's so much intrigue. Pynchon is piling so much on us as far as various interests and who's on whose side and who's switching sides, where it almost gets to be incoherent from a narrative standpoint, because the complexity of the narrative is so dense that you get the sense that everything is starting to break down. A lot of it is really funny. There's a lot of humor happening through a lot of this. There's also a lot of dark, twisted things happening as well. But yeah, those often go side by side in a Pynchon novel. So that middle section of the book, and then the book really getting into the final third, it really changes its tone dramatically, where we have something akin to like a quest narrative, you might call it, where there's a section in Russia where you have characters who are in search of some artifacts in Russia, and we have the Tugunska event, which happened in 1908, which was they're not sure what happened, but a major explosion happened in this part of Russia. Some people think it was a comet or a giant meteorite, and that forms a lot of the mystery and adventure of the last third of the book. But it gets very emotional, where the emphasis here is more on the relationships between the characters. There's a lot of romance as well in this section. I mean, there's a lot of intellectual ideas going on throughout this book, but as it keeps moving forward, we kind of move more into, like I said, emotional, sensual territory as we get to the last part of the book. So we have the interesting dichotomy as we get towards the end. Yeah, so that's in a very general way how the book is mapped out. And I think if we think about the narrative tensions in the book, like, Pynchon, there was one YouTuber I was watching who was talking about Pynchon as if he's a conspiracy theorist, and I would disagree with that. I don't think Pynchon himself is a conspiracy theorist. He puts a lot of that into his novels, and I'm sure he's an expert on every theory imaginable, but he does this to experiment with narrative and to deal with complexity, and that's such a tension in his book, especially as we're in the modern world, in the 20th century. How do we reconcile our need for a narrative with the complexity of the world and all the ideas and all the systematic forces in the world? And that's a big part of the book too, whether it's money, the force of money, the force of technology and science, and all of these things, interacting with each other. But the conspiracy side of it, where in I find in his books where each theory simply leads to a bigger theory. It's like this never ending chain of theories where it just all starts to break down. So a lot of when I read Pynchon, it's a lot of it is about how do we perceive reality, and how do we find narratives in the vast of so much complexity in the modern world. And I suppose that's a very postmodern idea. So yeah, I mean, overall, I did enjoy Against the Day. It's There's so much in here. There's so much going on. Um, there is a sense by the end that the characters have achieved. Some of the characters, the main characters, have achieved some sort of transcendence by the end, but that might be simplifying it a little bit. There's just some really moving, interesting things that happen towards the end of the novel. And you also get the sense of how much the world has changed as well. A big part of the last section is set in Hollywood. Okay, so we're in the early years of cinema, and almost like a film noirish type vibe we get towards the end of the book. But not all the characters, though. Some of the characters we might be hoping that we'll find some sort of meaning, and they don't. They simply don't. So we're not given that, I guess, that narrative satisfaction with every character. There's also the big theme in the book of the forces of order against the forces of anarchy and freedom is a big tension. I talked about Vineland, that was well over a year ago now, which is a big tension in that book. And especially, I see a lot of continuity between Vineland and Against the Day, where we have characters who are there to have their own agendas and want to reinforce the status quo and their order of things, and we have characters who are pushing against that in a number of different ways, and that's a fascinating conflict and tension that we get. I don't think it's quite clear where Pynchon's sympathies lie with the characters in that regard, but yeah, so that's another big tension of it. Yeah, but there's, like I said, there's some really moving passages towards the end of this, and there's one particular moment that is really it's like a strange, almost like it's like science fiction moment we get towards the end of this book, where I don't know, time is a big theme too, as far as how we process time and the passage of time goes. There are characters in here who just don't seem to age, and we wonder what's going on there too. So there's just a lot of fun mysteries of going on in this book. So yeah, I find with talking about Pynchon, it's best to just talk, talk about it. I mean, you can do a kind of a formal blow-by-blow review of the book and break it all down, and there's definitely a place for that. But I find with books like this, it's best just to kind of, just kind of do some stream of consciousness and just talk about it, because there's just so much being thrown at you in this book, and this an overload of information. And I think that's there for a reason too, because especially now in the 21st century, we're so overloaded with narratives and information and news all the time. And how do we deal with that? And I think reading an author like Thomas Pynchon can help us contextualize all that a little bit. It can give us a perspective on it. The way we perceive his books can be almost a way we can think about reality. I know for myself personally, reading books like this help me maybe making sense of reality is too strong a term, but at least finding some peace in all the madness. And that's one big takeaway I get from reading Pynchon and his other books. So yeah, I think I'll just kind of end with that thought. So thanks for watching. It's always great to get comments. If anyone has them on Thomas Pynchon or this book or his other books, I'm always curious to engage with others on this. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.